The train slowed as it crept across the dry Anatolian plain, its iron wheels grinding against the rails with a tired, almost reluctant rhythm. Dust rose in slow spirals behind it, as if even the earth itself resisted what was unfolding. Inside one of the crowded wagons, a young boy pressed his face against the wooden slats, squinting through the narrow gaps at a land that seemed endless and empty. He didn't yet understand why his mother's grip on his arm was so tight, or why no one spoke above a whisper. He only understood that something irreversible had already begun. Years before that train ever moved, the Armenian people had lived across the Ottoman Empire for centuries. They were a Christian minority within a vast, predominantly Muslim empire, spread across towns and villages in eastern Anatolia, as well as in cities like Constantinople. They farmed, traded, worshipped, and built lives rooted in deep cultural traditions. Their churches stood as markers of continuity, their language and customs preserved through generations. Yet beneath this long coexistence, tensions had been accumulating, shaped by political instability, shifting power structures, and growing nationalist ideologies. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the dominant force it once had been. It was weakening, losing territories, struggling with internal dissent, and facing pressure from European powers. Within this fragile state, suspicion began to fall more heavily on minority populations, including Armenians. The idea that Armenians might align themselves with foreign enemies or seek independence became a recurring fear among Ottoman authorities. This fear was not constant or uniform, but it grew stronger as the empire's decline accelerated. In the 1890s, waves of violence already hinted at what could come. Under Sultan Abdulhamid II, mass killings of Armenians occurred in several regions, leaving tens of thousands dead. These events established a precedent. A pattern where Armenians were framed as internal threats and violence against them was tolerated or encouraged under certain conditions. Although these massacres did not yet carry the full structure of what would later unfold, they created an atmosphere where suspicion and hostility were embedded into governance. The turning point came in the early 20th century, particularly after the rise of the Committee of Union and Progress, often referred to as the Young Turks. They came to power with promises of reform and modernization, presenting themselves as a force that would stabilize and rejuvenate the empire. But as time passed, their vision became increasingly shaped by a rigid form of nationalism. The idea of creating a more homogeneous state, ethnically and religiously aligned, began to take hold. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the conflict on the side of the Central Powers. War intensified existing fears and provided a context in which extreme measures could be justified under the guise of national security. The Eastern Front, where Ottoman forces clashed with the Russian Empire, became a focal point of anxiety. Some Armenian volunteers did join Russian forces, hoping for protection or autonomy, but this involvement was used broadly to cast suspicion on the entire Armenian population within the empire. In early 1915, the atmosphere shifted decisively. Orders began to circulate, first targeting Armenian soldiers within the Ottoman army. They were disarmed, reassigned to labor battalions, and in many cases executed. These actions removed a significant portion of able-bodied Armenian men from their communities, leaving villages and towns more vulnerable. It was a calculated move, though not always openly declared as such. Then came April 24, 1915, a date often marked as the beginning of the genocide. On that night, hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, leaders, clergy, and professionals in Constantinople were arrested. They were deported inland, many never to return. This removal of leadership dismantled the organizational and cultural backbone of the Armenian community. Without those figures, coordination and resistance became nearly impossible. Following these arrests, broader measures unfolded across the empire. The Ottoman government issued orders for the deportation of Armenians from their homes, particularly in eastern Anatolia. Officially, these deportations were framed as a relocation for security reasons, but the implementation revealed a far more devastating reality. Entire communities were forced to leave with little notice, allowed to carry only what they could manage. Homes, businesses, and belongings were abandoned, often looted or seized. The deportations were not simple transfers of population. They were long, grueling marches across harsh terrain, often toward the Syrian desert. Men, women, children, and the elderly were driven forward under the supervision of soldiers and irregular forces. Food and water were scarce. Protection was minimal or non-existent. Along these routes, countless people died from exhaustion, dehydration, starvation, or direct violence. Eyewitness accounts describe columns of people stretching for miles, their pace dictated by guards who showed little concern for survival. Some groups were attacked by bandits or militias, others subjected to systematic killings. There were instances where entire convoys disappeared, leaving no survivors to recount what had happened. The desert itself became both destination and method, a place where survival was nearly impossible. In certain areas, massacres occurred more directly. Villages were surrounded, populations gathered, and then killed en masse. Rivers became sites of drowning, fields sites of execution. The methods varied, but the outcome remained consistent: the destruction of Armenian communities. Children were not spared, though their experiences often took different forms. Some were forcibly taken, absorbed into Muslim households, converted, and raised under new identities. Others were left orphaned, wandering, or placed in institutions. These acts contributed to the fragmentation of Armenian identity, erasing connections to family and culture. Women faced additional layers of vulnerability. Many were subjected to abduction, forced marriage, or exploitation. Their journeys through the deportation routes often involved repeated trauma, with survival hinging on unpredictable circumstances. As the months passed, the scale of the destruction became evident. Reports from foreign diplomats, missionaries, and witnesses began to circulate, describing what they observed. Some used the term extermination to capture the systematic nature of the events. The Ottoman government, however, maintained its position that these were wartime measures, denying intent to destroy a population. By 1916, the majority of Armenians in eastern Anatolia had been displaced or killed. The Syrian desert, particularly areas like Deir ez-Zor, became synonymous with the final stages of the deportations. Camps formed there, though conditions were dire. Starvation, disease, and exposure claimed countless lives. For many, the journey ended not with a clear event, but with a slow fading under relentless conditions. Despite the scale of the violence, there were instances of resistance and survival. Some Armenians defended their towns, such as in Van, where temporary control was established before Russian forces arrived. Others were hidden or protected by neighbors, though such acts carried significant risk. These moments, while significant, were limited against the broader machinery of deportation and destruction. The end of World War I brought the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, but it did not bring immediate clarity or justice. Some officials were tried in post-war tribunals, and a few were sentenced for their roles. However, many key figures had already fled or avoided accountability. The geopolitical shifts that followed, including the rise of the Turkish Republic, complicated efforts to address what had occurred. For survivors, the aftermath was defined by displacement. Armenian communities that had existed for centuries were gone. Those who lived found themselves scattered across the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. Diaspora communities formed, carrying with them memories, stories, and fragments of a lost homeland. The term genocide itself did not exist at the time these events unfolded. It was later coined by Raphael Lemkin in the 1940s, influenced in part by what had happened to the Armenians. The concept provided a framework to describe the deliberate destruction of a people, not only through killing but through the erasure of culture, identity, and continuity. Debate over the characterization of the Armenian genocide has persisted for decades. Many scholars and countries recognize it as genocide, pointing to the coordinated nature of the deportations, the targeting of a specific ethnic and religious group, and the scale of the deaths, estimated at around 1 to 1.5 million. The Turkish government, however, has consistently rejected the term, acknowledging deaths but attributing them to the chaos of war rather than a deliberate policy of extermination. This disagreement has shaped international relations, historical narratives, and collective memory. For Armenians, the genocide remains a central element of identity, marked each year on April 24th. For others, It is a subject of study, reflection, and sometimes contention. Returning to the image of the train, it is only one fragment of a much larger story. Each person on that journey carried a life interrupted, families separated, histories cut short, futures erased. The boy at the window might have survived or might have vanished somewhere along the route. His story, like countless others, is part of a mosaic that resists complete reconstruction. What remains are traces, documents, testimonies, photographs, ruins of churches, and the memories passed down through generations. These fragments form the basis of understanding, though they can never fully capture the totality of what occurred. The Armenian Genocide stands as a case where state power, war, and ideology intersected in a way that led to the near destruction of an entire people within a specific region. Its study involves examining not only the events themselves, but the conditions that made them possible, the fears, decisions, structures, and narratives that converged at a particular moment in history. And so the train continues in memory, its slow movement across a barren landscape echoing through time, carrying with it the weight of countless untold stories, each one a thread in a history that remains both deeply studied and deeply felt.